Welcome to Lamore's Cards and Horrors. I'm Matthew, and this is another cEDH beginner guide video where I have experienced members of the community come on to teach you about one of their decks. If you enjoy this video, like, comment, subscribe, consider supporting me on Patreon so I can make more of these and make them better for you. And with that, I'll pass it over to this episode's guest.
Hello everyone, my name's Pongo. Probably know me from the primer for the list that we're about to talk about today is Najeela, the Blade Blossom. You might also know me from Team Turn 3, which is cEDH streaming supergroup on Twitch. You can find us on twitch.tv/Team Turn 3. So the deck is aptly named Najeela Tempo. What we're trying to do is stick Najeela as early as possible, and we're gonna sort of try to ride her as our sort of main threat, accruing warriors and kind of snowballing that way till such a point as we can easily combo off using a few different combo engines, or else just sit back using her as kind of a scaling threat on the table while accruing value through a number of different value engines. It's kind of a cross between a mid-range deck and then also a sort of more aggressive deck like a Winota style of game plan. So the early turns, you're definitely looking to develop a Najeela. If you can do that turn 1, that's ideal, off of something like a Jeweled Lotus or a Mana Crypt, or any of the combinations of fast mana that exist in this format. So once you've got early Najeela down, you are going to try to start snowballing warriors, getting those tokens developed so that you're gonna have an easier time eventually comboing off. You can kind of think of each of those warriors that you generate as like an extra mana when you are eventually trying to combo off with one of the Najeela specific win conditions. In addition to that very early developed Najeela plan, you kind of have a lot of different directions you can go from the first turn onward. So you can develop value engines, of which the deck has quite a few, and you can use those to either fight against other mid-range decks or to sort of maintain some kind of degree of card parity if a stacks deck is trying to pose a lot of the things going on at the table. In addition, you also have the option of pivoting to a number of different other game plans like Thassa's Oracle or Ad Nauseam, depending on if the early Najeela plan gets denied to you. But as far as Najeela herself is concerned, you're often trying to develop her early, get those tokens developed, and then land something like a Derevi Imperial Tactician or a Grim Hireling, which you're actually going to use to get infinite combats, which when you combine that with Najeela's ability to generate ever-increasing amount of warriors, you quickly are able to take down the table. The way Najeela works, whenever a warrior attacks, you can create a 1/1 white warrior creature token. That includes Najeela herself attacking, and it includes every subsequent warrior token that you make. So what we're ultimately trying to do is get a combo piece like Derevi Imperial Tactician in play or Grim Hireling. With Grim Hireling, the way it works is that every time you are able to successfully deal combat damage to an opponent, you can create 2 treasure tokens. So in a 4-player game with 3 opponents, you can hit 3 opponents and ultimately get 6 treasure tokens. So with Najeela's ability to pay 5 mana, that is Wooburg, take an additional combat step, then ultimately you are able to go infinite quite simply, just taking combats and dealing damage to the table and taking everyone out that way. With Derevi, it's a little bit more complicated, but it's still fairly easy to understand. So whenever you deal combat damage to an opponent, you get to tap or untap any permanent in play. So what that means is that if you've got, let's say, 5 creatures that are dealing combat damage to an opponent, you get 5 of these Derevi triggers. You can put all those triggers on, let's say, one command tower, and then you can tap the command tower for white, untap it by resolving the first Derevi trigger, tap it in response to the next Derevi trigger to generate a blue, and so on and so forth, ultimately netting Wooburg, taking an extra combat step. So this is certainly a mid-range deck, which means that we are generally trying to win in the mid-game. And the mid-game in cEDH, anywhere from turn 3 to turn 5. Najeela specific combos are not always easy to pull off on turn 3, particularly if you have a turn 2 Najeela, but they're very feasible to pull off if you've cast Najeela on turn 1. The reason for this is that it takes until that second combat until you're going to have 4 attacking warriors, Najeela and 3 additional tokens. That can either happen on turn 3 with a turn 1 Najeela or on turn 4 with a turn 2 Najeela. However, with fast mana, with the addition of things like Final Fortune, it is certainly possible to effectively win on turn 3, even with a turn 2 Najeela. As far as other decks in the format are concerned, we're faster than than sort of the dedicated mid-range decks, things like Thrasios Tymna, but slower than sort of the more dedicated Turbo Nas decks. So we're somewhere between those two in terms of speed. With things like Thassa's Oracle, you will have occasional miracle like turn 2, even potentially turn 1 wins. But for the most part, coming into turn 2 and turn 3, we're looking to be able to potentially interact with somebody else's win attempt, or else deploy a relevant stacks piece, something like a Dranith Magistrate or a Ranger Captain of Eos, things that will essentially make it difficult for opponents to enact their game plan, whether that's on turn 2 or turn 3. In addition, the deck can resolve ad nauseum early on. Typically, if you're doing this on turn 2, you will want to sequence Dockside Extortionist into your ad nauseum, but from turn 3 onward, you have a pretty successful main phase ad nauseum, even without Dockside Extortionist. So ideally on turn 1, your best opener will almost always involve casting Najeela. Failing that, it's perfectly acceptable, and I do this all the time, to keep a turn 1 mana dork into turn 2 Najeela hand. Those are not really the exciting hands, but they're sort of the bread and butter hands, depending on the pod. But ideally, our turn 1 is going to be Najeela into turn 2, representing interaction or developing a value engine. Ideally, you would get to cast your 2 mana value engine while also being able to represent 1 mana interaction, and the deck is very much built to be able to do that. Coming into turn 3, we are looking at the turn where it is most likely that you're going to be able to win with Najeela Combos. In the ideal circumstance where you had Najeela turn 1, and you are able to now swing and have 4 attackers, this would be a great time to put Derevi onto the stack. If it seems like your opponents are not representing removal or not representing interaction, or else you have the ability to protect it, try to put Derevi into play as soon as possible and win from there. So the biggest things to pay attention to when you're learning this deck is definitely things like combat math. You need to understand when your opponents are not going to be willing to block. I see a lot of people, especially players new to the deck, who will frequently lose out on their opportunity to either net a warrior because they're concerned about Najeela getting blocked in combat. You need to weigh the risk of losing Najeela compared to the cost an opponent would have to pay in blocking Najeela. So for example, if somebody puts a Tymna down, and that seems to be pretty central to their game plan, in many situations, it would be incorrect for an opponent to block Najeela, and so it might be free to attack in with Najeela. And so you kind of develop a sense for when you can engage in that type of theoretically risky attack. It comes with a little bit of experience, but also just understanding when a cost will be too great for one of your opponents relative to the rest of the table. Another thing that I think people don't always consider with this deck is that it's a deck that doesn't need to win super duper early. You don't need to push for wins turn 3 or turn 4. So a lot of the time, just because of the inevitability that Najeela provides, the fact that you're going to be continuously netting additional attackers the longer you wait, your wins get easier and easier. As I was mentioning before, creature tokens, your warriors in play, you can effectively think of them as mana. And so the more of them that you have in play, the less additional mana you will need when you're eventually trying to win with Derevi, for instance. So another thing to consider with this deck is perfectly capable of operating without Najeela whatsoever. A big part of that is knowing sort of what your pivot points are. When am I going to pivot from the Najeela game plan to a different game plan, depending on any number of factors. Just having Thassa's Oracle in the deck is a great way to pivot away from the Najeela game plan. And also in addition to that, the deck plays ad nauseum. So you have sort of these different pillars of the deck, whether it's ad nauseum, Thassa's Oracle, or Najeela herself, that I would say are all equally important and all sort of equally supported. And you sort of have to know, depending on the pod, which one you're going to prioritize, and also how to switch between them as the game develops. So general rules of thumb for mulliganing are that you are certainly at minimum looking for a turn 2 Najeela and ideally a turn 1 Najeela. In addition to that, you are going to probably want a tutor or a relevant piece of interaction or a value engine, depending on the composition of the pod that you're in. So in more mid-rangey, stacksy pods, perhaps you might be more interested in value engine and maybe a piece of interaction, whereas in faster pods, you are almost certainly going to want 1 or 2 more relevant pieces of interaction. And the deck plays a really high density of sort of gas cards, which is to say big kind of payoffs, whether it be win conditions or tutors for win conditions. So it is not unusual to keep hands that might be a little light on action in favor of hands that have a little bit more interaction, just expecting to draw into a payoff at some point. This hand is a little bit heavy on mana dorks. If one of those mana dorks was a land, then I would actually be okay with this, perhaps on a second 7. As a first 7, I would most certainly mulligan this just because it's a little bit lacking in terms of a game plan. It has most of what we're looking for, at least initially in terms of developing mana, but if you miss that second land drop, then you end up having to spend turn 2 playing a mana dork or 2, and you're not developing Najeela, which means that you're going to run into the risk of opponents being able to deploy their blockers, and then it's really hard to get rolling with Najeela. So on a first 7, I'm certainly mulliganing this just because it's not quite good enough. So this is a pretty reasonable 7-card hand, especially if we can expect that there's going to be at least one blue deck in the pod. It is very likely to be able to develop Carpet of Flowers early on, but fallback plan of being able to develop a Mystic Remora and then get a Carpet of Flowers down on turn 2, and then theoretically just getting Najeela down a little bit later is pretty good with this hand. So there's multiple ways to take it depending on turn order, depending on pod composition. So I like this hand. It's really hard to ship a hand with 2 of the strongest cards in the format, that being Mystic Remora and Carpet of Flowers. As a mull down to 5, this is reasonable, I think. It feels pretty easy to just put back the Utopia Sprawl because we're missing a forest. So you have the option of putting back the Thran Quarry just because there's some risk of that not being turned on early on, just because there's no mana dork in this hand. Or else you could put back something like the Eladamri's Call in favor of just playing the Worldly Tutor. So there's a couple different ways you can take this. I think it's a perfectly fine hand. It's only really awkward if you're going first, where the Exotic Orchard might not be making mana. But if you're going second, playing an early Mystic Remora or else Worldly Tutoring into like a Dockside Extortionist are both perfectly serviceable game plans. And I think on 5, this is where you're happy to keep something like a Mystic Remora opener. So the deck's best matchups are certainly your kind of average or like mixed composition pods. So if there's like a mid-range deck, a turbo deck, and a stacks deck, or, you know, a stacks deck and 2 turbo decks, and you get to be there as one of the other mid-range deck, then you're in pretty reasonable shape, being able to kind of coast through most of what the stacks decks are doing, as well as grinding alongside the more mid-range decks, putting pressure onto the table the entire time, while being able to essentially interact with anything that the turbo decks might want to do early on. So realistically, the deck is pretty good into a wide spread of different pods. The pods where it struggles the most would be sort of the all turbo pods. So if you find yourself up against 3 really fast and non-interacted decks, if you're going 4th, then your chances of winning are quite low, just by virtue of the fact that it's going to be very hard to fight 3 decks all looking to go fast, and you're also just behind in terms of the initiative. That being said, if you're going first, you can mulligan to certain hate pieces like early Drannith Magistrates that might help you navigate that game, but it's still an uphill battle just by virtue of the fact that those decks are all looking to enact their game plan as fast as possible. Najeela Tempo, or mid-range Najeela, is a very flexible and adaptive deck that you can expect to do well with in a very wide variety of pods. The deck has very high card quality in terms of playing pretty much all the staples in 5 colors. It's very resilient against stacks, and it's extremely consistent at being able to enact its game plan in the time frame that it's looking to enact its game plan. You play high quality interaction, and the deck is highly customizable for your own particular setting. So even if you find yourself consistently playing against sort of more turbo oriented decks instead of your average open field, you can tune the deck to be more aggressive. That's always an option that's available to you because you're just playing 5 colors and you have access to the entire card pool. Najeela is, as I was saying earlier, very resilient, and you can pretty much play it into any pod and have a fighting chance.